Hello and welcome to Africa 54. I'm Chamberlain Uso at Channels Television here in Lagos. I'm joined by Vincent Makori at Voice of America in Washington.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm Vincent Makori at our global headquarters in Washington, D.C. Happy to be with you again for another edition of Africa 54. Let's start off with a look at tackling recruitment by terrorist groups. Chamberlain Uso in Lagos brings you that story.
Terrorism is a security challenge in many parts of the world. In Africa, groups such as Al-Shabaab, Ansar-Din and Boko Haram continue to unleash terror, often using radicalized members of the public to carry out their attacks. Despite immense resources deployed by governments to combat terrorism, it is spreading to more countries. According to an analysis by ORB Media, this can be linked to a failure to stop the terror groups from radicalizing vulnerable people.
Since the launch of a campaign of terror in 2009, Boko Haram insurgents have wreaked havoc in parts of northern Nigeria and neighboring Chad, Niger and Cameroon. Some of their attacks are carried out by people they kidnap, such as in cases of suicide bombings. The group also recruits vulnerable people in society to serve as fighters. While some of them remain loyal to the ideology of violent extremism, others turn around. In Nigeria, a de-radicalization program called Operation Safe Corridor is helping former Boko Haram members reintegrate into society. Some of them say socio-economic factors pushed them into violence.
Any crisis you see is linked to ignorance and poverty. I call on government to improve education and small-scale businesses.
Under the program, which started in 2016, repentant Boko Haram members are taken through rehabilitation and vocational training.
Operation Safe Corridor has successfully rehabilitated and reintegrated 6 associated persons and facilitated the rehabilitation of 750 cleared men, women and children, and their subsequent release to their respective state governments in collaboration with some domestic and international NGOs.
According to ORB Media's analysis of the Global Terrorism Database, ISIS has recruited from over 100 countries, and the number of countries experiencing terrorist attacks has been rising since 2004. It also says over 100 countries experienced attacks in 2016 and 2017, more than any year in this century. In faraway Indonesia, in a town called Solo, Hamanto, a restaurant owner, engages young people to deter them from joining violent groups. He started his business with his friend Wasiron, who he fears may be a target of radicalization. Hamanto knows this because he was a former terrorist himself.
Wasiran is my neighbor, and I know him from Quran studies. I took him in because he's less fortunate, so he won't turn to violence.
I used to be chaotic and didn't care about others. After I learned from Hamanto, I was able to control my emotions.
In 2002, Hamanto helped build a car bomb that killed 202 people and injured hundreds more in Bali. After serving 4 years of a 6-year sentence, he's now trying to prevent others from joining terrorist groups. And it's easy to see why the public remains a source of recruitment.
I actually analysed every single tweet that came out on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's governance Twitter feed. And, all right, it's not a perfect measure, but I noticed that 56% of all tweets were about community development projects. And that, I think, enabled the population, or enabled Al-Qaeda to get the population on side just enough to let them go about their business.
Be it homegrown or foreign terrorist groups, experts believe counter-terrorism efforts must include detecting potential terrorists and monitoring such individuals closely. When it comes to fighting terrorism, governments spend a lot of money on nearly everything, including training and equipping security personnel. but little attention is paid to preventing people from becoming indoctrinated in the first place. Closing the pipeline of those joining terrorist ranks could prove to be very effective in stopping global terrorism from spreading further.
So to give us some more perspective, we've got a security consultant, Mr. Temitope Olodo. He joins us from the UK. Thank you for joining us on Africa 54. So could you go ahead and tell us, what do you think is at the root of terrorists getting people to accept the ideologies, hence recruiting them?
I think with regard to terrorist groups that of religious inclination, the main strand is very, very clear. What the terrorists normally do is twist the narrative or the ideology and have evidence-based to link it up, i.e. they use religious scripts to more or less assert their narrative, and that creates the belief for the narrative which they use. And that is why it's quite difficult for government, people that work within the prevent aspect of terrorism to actually counter those narratives, because most of the religious narrative needs a superior narrative to address it. But more importantly, it's an issue of education, because if people are educated, and I'm not talking about being educated in a Western way, but if they understand, the narrative, or they understand their rights within a community, when they have grievances, they're able to channel those different grievances through the right channel. But where people are ignorant and in poverty, and then you have a narrative that more or less, push them in a particular route, they are more receptive to those ideologies. So some job of work there for the authorities to do. But could you connect the dots, shed some light? How do you suggest governments, security forces, and the entire society prevent these sort of recruitments? I think it's a very simple approach to it. One of the things we need to look at is how do Boko Haram in the force systems or organizations of this nature recruit their members? Where are they getting them from? Where is the pool of recruitment? Then you develop an anti-recruitment strategy, i.e. you develop your own way of disrupting that recruitment drive. We know, for example, from recorded information or reliable sources that they tend to give money out like a loan, and they use that to entrap some of the vulnerable individuals. So government need to work more in that area. And more importantly, knowing that they recruit youths between the age of 12 to 25 who are out of school or within their reach, involved in drugs. Government need to develop a way of engaging those individuals and taking them away from a life of crime, a life of drugs. So those are the kind of strategy that the government need to have. But more importantly, government need to develop a strategy to deconstruct those individuals that are vulnerable to radicalization by this group.
Now, speaking about surveillance, there are several cases where those who were initially on different watch lists somehow find themselves carrying out those activities, escaping those watch lists. What must we do differently to ensure that those who are on those lists don't get to carry out those acts?
I think there are different best practices around the world that could be adopted. But I think in the first instance, especially with regard to countries in Africa, one of the things that they need to do more is to develop the frontline staff, i.e. people that work in schools, people that work in prison, people that work in hospitals, to be able to realize or understand the trigger of radicalization and extremism. Once they are able to identify individuals who are moving towards this route, then it is easy to intervene and help those individuals to move away from it and become productive members of the community. Now, when individuals are on watch list, government needs to develop its intelligence base within the community and even within the enforcement industry to be able to follow those individuals and identify them. When an individual is identified, it's not just identified alone, it's identified with his number, it's identified with his location. So you'll be able to understand how many people he's engaging with and be able to bring more people into the pool to be able to ensure that he's disrupted in whatever he wants to do.
Right then, Mr. Temitope Olodo, security consultant, thank you for talking to us on Africa 54.
Thank you for having me.